How do we get hyped? Podcast hype.
Podcast hype. Okay. I was reading the Weekly Worker for the first time ever today.
Oh, cool.
It didn't seem like it was marketed towards workers, I'll say that.
Not marketed toward what?
Not marketed towards workers. It seemed like it was marketed towards, like, Mike McNair, and that's it.
Yeah. I mean, it's very... it's difficult, isn't it? Like, it's written by intellectuals, for the most part.
Yeah.
And quite good, acclaimed intellectuals.
Yeah, quite good. Quite good.
Quite good intellectuals.
What happened this week? I have no idea anything that happened this week. How are you doing?
I'm alright. What happened?
This is gonna be a high energy podcast.
Yeah, high energy. I'm feeling hyped. I'm feeling enthusiastic.
Woo!
I was going to ask you quite seriously.
Oh God.
I was curious to know what your general thoughts are on the man that is. No, what your thoughts are on the person, Aaron Sorkin.
Aaron Sorkin. I don't think I've ever seen anything. Oh no, I've seen The Social Network, which he did.
Oh, did he direct that?
I don't know.
I've really no idea.
That's it. That's all I know him from. And it seemed like the movie you would expect for Hollywood making a movie about Mark Zuckerberg. Yeah. So I don't know. What about you?
Yeah. I watched The Trial of the Chicago 8 recently, which is a new Netflix film about.
Did he do that?
He did. Yeah. I think wrote and directed.
Yeah. Wow.
And yeah, it just sort of set me thinking, because I've watched The West Wing and quite enjoyed it at the time. I mean, it's meant to be the favourite of liberals, and I was probably a liberal at the time, so I was probably its perfect demographic.
Yeah.
But yeah, this most recent film, The Trial of the Chicago 8, I enjoyed quite a lot, and it has all of those sort of Sorkin elements.
Tropes.
Sort
of like
Sorkin. Yeah, smart talking, quick talking, dialogue that's not really natural or real, but I really quite enjoy it, and that's what I quite enjoyed about The West Wing as well. It's kind of like, it's theatrical and comical, and like it's non-human, it's not particularly real, but there is something sort of like attractive and endearing. And
is The West Wing serious? Is it a drama? I don't know anything. Okay.
Yeah. But it's got. But it's got enough like comic.
Yeah.
It's got enough sort of comic beats to keep you going.
Sure.
I'm very dependent on comic relief. If a movie has absolutely no comic relief and its subject matter is sufficiently bleak, I'm just wrecked by it.
Yeah.
I really need some amount of like comic relief in just about everything.
Yeah.
I couldn't work out whether this, in the Trial of the Chicago 8, I couldn't work out whether the comic relief or the comicness of some of the characters was complementary, or whether it was a good juxtaposition against the violence of the riots and what the police did to the protesters in 68, or whether it was... I mean, I didn't feel like the film focused enough on the level of violence that was sort of perpetrated by the police. I felt like it didn't sufficiently blame the police. Yeah. Although it did not blame the police, kind of thing.
Sure. I mean, they weren't the good guys, presumably.
Sorry?
They weren't the good guys.
They were not the good guys, no. But it's Sorkin's, I mean, it's probably an obvious enough point, but it does feel like this was a very good example of what Aaron Sorkin does, which is he has all of his characters speak toward one truth, kind of thing. Like, even if people are seemingly representing different positions, there's always a reconciliation.
Sure, yeah.
Everything always sort of like coalesces around one sort of point, to the point where it feels like the film is speaking with one voice, and all of these characters just sort of add to it. So even when there's any amount of conflict between characters, it all sort of reconciles to some extent.
Yeah. Go back to episode 1.
Yes.
Yeah, where we talk about liberal view of conflict.
Yeah.
Get the plug in.
So early. It felt like it did some Yeah, I mean, I don't really know anything about the actual characters. I'd only ever heard of Abbie Hoffman and had never really sort of like come across him as a character kind of thing. And he was obviously the perfect, and whoever the other character depicted, or the other real person depicted in the film, one of his collaborators in the Yippie movement, they're perfect sort of Sorkin characters in that. They're comic by their nature and by the nature of the politics or the political actions that they took. But even Hoffman, I don't know what actually happened in the courtroom when that trial was actually happening, but even Hoffman is sort of bent round toward speaking to the sort of liberal point of view. There's a point when he's on the stand toward the end, and sort of like likens the 4-year election cycle in America to being equivalent to the revolutionary overthrow of the government kind of thing. to the point where it's like his advocacy of revolution. He's saying that like I might speak to revolution, or the founding fathers might have sort of like spoke about the importance of the potentiality of a revolutionary overthrow of the government, but he says that revolutionary overthrow actually it happens every 4 years when we elect out the now whether he said that, whether he would have sort of like whether he did actually condone that idea, I have no idea, because I don't actually know very much about the actual events. But it was one of these like take the most sort of clownishly radical. Here throughout the movie is depicted the most belligerent character in the courtroom, the person that's most willing to stick his finger up against authority, and then by the end sort of bend him to the point where he's in basically the same position as his counterparts on who were all, the other characters who were also being tried, who were much more kind of like liberal in their politics. I don't know, anyway.
Why are we even doing a Marxist podcast then, if that's the case? We get a revolution every 4 years?
Yeah.
My God, why are we even trying? Jesus, I had no idea. Big revolution this year. Boy. We did it.
I watched that film.
Yeah, I've had many people tell me to watch it, and I probably won't watch it. Just because people tell me to watch a lot of things, and I just don't really watch it.
Yeah, don't trust people.
It's not so much that. It's just like, what am I going to do? Sit down and watch it? I don't know.
Yeah. That's fair enough.
Yeah, I don't know. There's too much content. Too much content.
Oh, yeah, you can't. Yeah, I mean, that's sort of what I feel about some fields of things, like graphic novels.
Wait a minute,
or
are we
something,
making
for
a
example.
podcast?
We're making content.
We're
like making premiere content, which should sort of like...
That's true, premiere content.
Should be high up on people's lists.
It's true. Yeah, this is the best kind of content.
If you are time poor...
It's true. On your way to do things.
We'll condense it all. We'll just condense all possible content into one.
Yeah, this is the view.
The perfect synthesis.
Yeah. Welcome.
I don't know.
To Auxiliary Statements. I had a moment today. Oh, first, I'm Jack.
I'm Dan.
There we go. I had a moment today where I forgot if it was statements or statement, because I didn't know if it was up on Google Podcasts, so I had to search for it. I was like, Auxiliary State. I was like, wait a minute. I was like, is it statement or statements? It's statements. And the answer is yes, it's on Google Podcasts. So if any of you freaks are using that, it's there. Don't know why. We have one listen on Google Podcasts.
Oh, don't know who that was. You know who you are?
Yeah, you know who you are. Well, that was on the first episode and they haven't been back since, so maybe they don't know who they are.
They don't know who they are.
Yeah.
No, we shall never know.
Yeah. Good week for you?
Yeah.
Question mark?
I'm exhausted.
Yeah.
It's
sure.
all right.
One of those.
Winter is setting in.
Winter is setting in.
Everything gets more and more bleak by the day.
It does.
It just gets darker and darker.
I went for a walk at like 1:30 today and the light had already changed and I was just like, ugh.
Yeah, there was a day the other day when it didn't seem to get light at all.
Yeah, I know.
We've gone from dark to overcast
to
some new type of darkness again.
Ugh.
And I'm finding that I both have a massive surplus of evening.
Yeah,
like,
I know.
It's just suddenly the evening, but also I don't find any productive way of actually spending it.
Yeah.
So I'm both sort of frustrated.
Yeah.
I'm frustrated on both ends of the spectrum.
Yeah, I know. It was funny. Yeah.
I have no time. No, I have too much time, and also it's sort of fleeting somehow at the same time.
I know. Today we're recording a little bit later than we usually do, and I was like, it's like 6:30 p.m. right now. And when I texted Dan, that I was like, oh, we might have to do it a little bit later. Let's do it at 6:30. I was like, God damn it, that's so late. It's been dark for hours. Yeah. Why did I say that?
It's supposed to be tucked up.
Oh, God.
Warding off the
demons in the winter. Speaking of demons, speaking of winter, speaking of Aaron Sorkin, this week, Dan, we're talking a little fantasy. We're talking a little sword and sandal adventures. We're talking a little sci-fi. And we're kind of having a break from the hard stuff here. We're doing. I also forgot the name of this. We're doing Why Fantasy Matters Too Much, which is an essay by Jack Zipes, who I like quite a bit because Jack Zipes, I came across him. He's kind of like, I don't know what you'd call him, maybe like a literary theorist, maybe like he likes fairy tales. He's kind of a bit of a freak, but he's a Marxist, kind of like literary theorist, cultural theorist, my kind of freak. And this essay, Why Fantasy Matters Too Much, published in 2009 in the Journal of Aesthetic Education, which is a University of Illinois thing, I guess. And yeah, we're talking about it. It's not very long. That's why it's kind of one of the reasons I suggest we do it. But
we needed a break. We needed a bit of a break.
Yeah.
A departure from the norm again.
Yeah,
Another departure from the norm.
From what we usually do. But yeah, Jack Zipes, I came across him because he'd written not quite a bit, but he'd written a bit about Tolkien, kind of seriously. He's very inspired by the Frankfurt School cultural theory stuff, the Adornos, Horkheimers, but specifically kind of a lesser known theorist named Ernst Bloch. We'll talk a little bit about in this. But yeah, this was a weird one because like I said, I like Jack Zipes. I like what he talks about. I like fantasy, obviously, and combining like Marxism with fantasy and Marxism with like his previous work where he talks a bit about Tolkien. I was just like, oh my God, somebody's done this. Oh my God, I can't believe it. But it was interesting because I don't know how there's a lot of stuff in here that I don't think I agree with.
I struggled.
Yeah. There's a bit where quite a bit of it is him recounting the plots of things I haven't read and don't really plan on reading to make his point. But there were some gems in the rough, I think. Like I said, I do like Jack Zipes. So I'm kind of interested to see where this conversation goes. Because I was having a really hard time, even though I'd read this before and kind of picked it apart a bit. I was having a hard time going from kind of like more, I hesitate to kind of call sociology like a hard science, but more like hard sciencey stuff like economics and political theory to cultural theory, right? I found that pretty jarring, like going from last week talking about the origin of capitalism and arbitrage, which I've not realized that's how it's pronounced, not arbitrage, which I found a little fancy. I think so. Wow. Well, I looked up the definition and then hit play on the definition. They said arbitrage. So there you go.
I don't know. I want to contest that.
All right. Well, maybe that was an American dictionary. We can call it arbitrage. I think it's a little fancy. But yeah, it was hard going from that to this. What do you think?
Yeah. I had a similar experience. It's definitely written in a sort of cultural studies style.
It's fancy.
It's fancy.
He starts with an anecdote.
It's fancy. And I think there are some concessions to an effort to present good prose.
Sure.
That actually sometimes miscommunicate what's intended to communicate.
I absolutely agree. Yeah. And I think one of my main issues with that, we'll come to it with this piece, but I think that might have been the reason that it kind of tripped me up. Because I think I will get to it, but there's a bigger point that I was confused by, and I think it's exactly that. Yeah.
And going from the Mixon's Wood book, where every premise is meticulously laid out. Yeah, it takes a little while. They are in there in this essay. He does sort of define his premises. He does define some terms. But when I was just starting to read it, I was like, "There's a lot of slippage here between terms going on. There's there's fantasy.
Exactly. Yeah.
There's I can't remember what the other one is. Anyway,
the other one.
He talks about desire, which doesn't really get a very good definition. There's some talk of imagination. Yeah. But there's not. There is a little bit of effort to distinguish fantasy from imagination. And as you say, it does feel like it's grounded in a kind of speculation, and not grounded in anything more than that kind of thing.
Yeah, it's funny.
So it's meant to be speaking to a common experience. But if you don't share that common experience of whatever is the human act of fantasy, or if you come at it with different sort of connotations, a lot of it revolves around. Sort of his interpretation of what a common understanding of what fantasy is. Yeah. And I think to some extent I was coming from a different place. Colloquial or my normal use of fantasy is quite different. Is a kind of personal psychological, as a personal psychological term. and it is informed more by sort of psychoanalysis and that kind of thing than it is a sort of general creative act, which seems to be more in line with what he's angling at, right?
Yeah.
But that distinction is in this piece to some extent, because there is a sort of dichotomy presented between fantasy as being liberatory or opening the way toward helping with sort of liberatory creative thinking and thought, and utopian thinking to some extent. But it is also depicted as something which is
delusory.
Delusory, exactly, and has the potential to either sort of promote the norm and the status quo when it's coming as a kind of like when cultural products have a fantasy element, but when they're sort of like
spectacles.
when cultural products are designed to support the status quo but still use fantasy elements to do that. But there is also the sort of like personal act of fantasy, which seems to be quite a lot to do with constructing a stable world in which you can exist in, kind of thing. There's an extent to which fantasy helps one cope with the world rather than makes one want to rebel against it.
Absolutely.
But it is an interesting distinction, and one really worth talking about and thinking about. And it's a dichotomy that's quite they're not extremely opposed terms, kind of thing. I think there's probably quite a lot of slippage between the two, and you can be doing one and then you can be doing the other.
It's also subjective.
And exactly. Yeah.
So we will get to the piece literally, meaning that we'll like quote some stuff from it and talk about it. But before we do that, I'm going to quote something completely different. So I'm going to quote a little. You might have heard of this guy, a little Karl Marx, and I'm going to quote something from when he was working with the IWA, the International Working Men's Association. This is from the instructions for the delegates of the Provisional General Council, titled "The Different Questions." Right, and so here he's talking about cooperatives.
You've done a deep dive.
I've done a bit of a deep dive, and you'll see where I'm going with this hopefully in just a second.
I'm excited.
So this is from the section titled "Cooperatives." He says, "We acknowledge the cooperative movement as one of the transforming forces of the present society based upon class antagonism. Its great merit is to practically show that the present pauperizing and despotic system of the subordination of labor to capital can be superseded by the republican and beneficent system of the association of free and equal producers, restricted, however, to the dwarfish forms into which individual wage slaves can elaborate it by their private efforts. The cooperative system will never transform capitalist society." So the point that he's making there is, he's kind of like, we support cooperatives because they show people that there's a different way of doing things, right? But he said that the cooperative itself isn't an alternative because it's basically still the same things. To say nothing of that they're engaging in markets, it's still basically people being exploited to produce wealth, right? It doesn't matter really that it's like a board of people who are, probably workers still running the thing. It's still doing the exact same thing. But he kind of ties that into the broader point of like the point of a communist party and of a people's party is it'll always be pertinent if it can show that there are possible alternatives, that this is an alternative. And while it does that, it's going to be a threat to the established order, right? And so I think the connection there to this essay that we're reading is that Jack Zipes is kind of saying that culture can have the same effect and that media can have the same effect, right? But that it doesn't really right now. Because to Zipes, and I suppose this is an idea kind of first propagated by Ernst Bloch, is that in the kind of like broader Frankfurt school, is that like all good art, which, that's like a little pretentious, I guess, but all good art has like some sort of utopian element to it, or some sort of dissatisfaction with the way things are. And while there's going to be media, or in this case, what we're talking about is fantasy, that has that kind of fantastical element to it, it's going to be inspiring, right? And so I think that's where the first kind of issue that we might have with this piece is that, yeah, that's absolutely true. And there need to be utopian forms of art. There need to be inspiring artistic pieces, fantasy, media, movies, books, whatever it is, to kind of show us that there are possibilities to change the current social relations that we have. But it's like, the title of this piece is Why Fantasy Matters Too Much. And it's like, what do you mean by fantasy? And I think he kind of flip-flops on it a little bit. Maybe not flip-flops, but it's like going from the Ellen Meekson's Wood stuff, it's like if she was writing this, and she wouldn't be because this isn't her area of expertise, but like fantasy would have a very specific definition, much like capitalist and capitalism does in her book, right? But here, fantasy doesn't really have a very specific definition. And he doesn't mean fantasy like we think of it as like Lord of the Rings and like Conan the Barbarian and stuff like that. He kind of generally means it a lot more broad. Fantasy is like in a painting when it's like some sort of utopian idealism, right? That's fantasy to him too. And so he like is caught between being this guy who studies Brothers Grimm and studies Lord of the Rings and studies all of these actual like what we would think of as fantasy things, and that's what he wants to talk about. But at the same time, he's also just talking about like all art, right? And it's a little bit like, oh, it's a little bit disorienting trying to understand this piece. You see what I'm getting at? Yeah. So yeah, that's why I brought up the cooperative thing, is because it's like he's trying to establish this connection between media showing us what is possible, but whereas now it does the opposite, which is what you were saying, which is kind of like delude us into thinking that there is no alternative, right? And whereas like sci-fi might have used to have been in the book that I'm forcing Dan to read right now, which is The Dispossessed, which is something that is like very explicit in its utopian kind of thinking, is like, here's an alternative. That's what the whole book's about. It's like about an anarchist society, right? And then like a communist society and a capitalist society and the way they all interact. But it's like now he's kind of saying that you have stuff like Warhammer or something like that, where it's like, to him, that's not as great because it's like, things are going to be bad in the future and that's about it. And again, he kind of flip-flops on that too, but yeah, it's a weird distinction, right, between fantasy as utopian and fantasy as delusory.
Yeah, often it feels like fantasy. Well, what I'm most familiar with is fantasy television and fantasy film.
Sure.
Maybe what I mean really is sci-fi rather than fantasy. But maybe we can use the two in conjunction. Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of slippage. I mean, his general definition of fantasy seems to come from Adorno to some extent, where he's just saying that all artwork can have some... Fantasy is just an element that pieces of art have.
And it could be good and it could be bad, right?
Yeah. Oh, I see what you mean. Yeah, it could fulfill the sort of like... It could speak to liberatory desire in human beings, or it could... support the status quo in some way, or numb people to their present existence, kind of thing. Yeah, it's interesting. There was a few years ago when I used to look for in films to some extent films which depicted. I used to think there was something good about films that depicted a bleak future.
Sure.
Because at least it was like, watch out, otherwise this is what you're going to get.
Gotcha. Yeah.
But you're right to say that we do not get like blatantly utopian fiction in the mainstream in the way that you may have once done, kind of thing. Yeah. And to just say, well, it's good, at least good enough that like the general people's general conception of the future is it's probably going to be pretty shit.
Yeah.
At least puts us in the position to want to do something about it now. But I don't know, does it do that? Or does it I mean, a lot of people might just be resigned to the bleakness of the future, kind of thing. Like, be nice to know about that, people's general concept that we live around there's a lot of apocalypse, isn't there?
There's a lot of apocalypse. Yeah.
There is a lot of apocalyptic threat in our present existence, kind of thing. Well, I mean, climate change is the big and obvious example. Yeah. But like climate change breaks down into a whole series of different
Sure. Yeah. Well, he brings that up. I'll read, I'm going to read two quotes. They're not super long, but one of them is just to kind of establish his thesis. So he says, it's through fantasy that we've always sought to make sense of the world, not through reason. Reason matters, but fantasy matters more. Perhaps it has mattered too much, and our reliance on fantasy may wear thin and betray us, even while it nourishes us and gives us hope that the world could be a better place. We've imagined gods, the kingdom of a single god, the miraculous feats of divine and semi-divine characters, and the commandments that have been established to lead us to the good life, if not to paradise. It is through the fictive projections of our imaginations, based on personal experience, that we have sought to grasp, explain, and alter and comment on reality. This is why such staples as the Bible and Grimm's fairy tales have become canonical texts. Unlike reality, they allegedly open the mysteries of life and reveal ways in which we can maintain ourselves and our integrity in a conflict-ridden world. So that's kind of his general thesis, right?
Yeah, and I think I agree.
Yeah.
To a large extent. Either personal or collective narrative informs our understanding of the world in which we live, even if it's not directly like scientific or factual. There is always a it feels to me anyway that there's always some kind of supplement needed, that sort of complements our understanding, or even is like I mean, I'd probably go so far as to say that like our entire interaction with the world is heavily mediated either by personal narrative or by collective narrative. And I mean, coming back to what we talked about in the first episode when we were talking about class consciousness to some extent, and jumping back to some of the themes you were suggesting earlier, was like we have come across this idea, right? Like, if we want to develop a certain type of revolutionary consciousness in a certain portion of the population, it's not a matter of giving them the right facts and details and having them all be sort of like drones to a certain type
Listen to this podcast
very
and this other
specific
podcast.
ideology. Yeah. It's more about like sparking a kind of desire in their sort of like I don't know, relationship to the world and their desires for the future and wishes kind of thing.
The spark that lights the prairie fire. Who said that?
I think both in the terms of like what it is to be a human being, and also in terms of what it might potentially be to be a revolutionary subject.
Absolutely.
Narrative, and in his case fantasy, perhaps more important than whatever the alternative is.
Yeah, but it's also like fantasy. Like, again, like when he says fantasy, it's like exactly what you're saying could just be imagination, right? And I guess that's kind of the point that he's making, is that when he gets into the whole like culture industry stuff and kind of like mass media narratives penetrating like your subconscious, that's, I guess he's kind of saying that it's like, sure, these narratives of kind of like being okay with our current social relations seep into the media, but they also seep into our imagination. So before we get to that, let me read this next quote. This is kind of what you were saying about climate change and stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
so he says,
this. I know where you're going.
Huh?
It's a good. I think this is a good quote. I think I know where you're going.
This is a damn good quote. Hopefully it's the right quote. He says,
I'll just say that it is.
Wow, what a great quote. He says,
it's the perfect quote.
It's the perfect quote. He says, fantasy contests reality and it also becomes conflated with reality. But our fantasy and the fantasies that we conceive have become desperate because they're outstripped by real existing conditions that instrumentalize them at every waking second of the day and even when we slumber. It is a commonplace today that fantasy, especially science fiction and what we label fantasy in the world of art, cannot keep pace with the devastating and disturbing fantastic of real occurrences, or what I'd call the incredible credibility of the real.
Yeah. That's one of those sort of like linguistic artistic
That's pretty snazzy. I like that.
It's a nice line. I mean, I like a good line.
It's a nice
It's not quite
line.
a pun, but it's kind of...
It's fun.
Yeah.
When the normal is so fantastically abnormal, what role can fantastic artworks play in our lives? Is the violence that we encounter in our everyday lives so much more fantastic than in literature, film, and the arts that we seek to consume the fantastic, like harmless junk food as quick fixes and consolation? Can our joys really and realistically be enjoyed and nourished through the fantastic? Is there hope for the fantastic and much less hope for our to alter our social relations of exploitation and delusion? That's the second page.
What, in its entirety?
yeah, exactly. So he goes in right there. But yeah, I mean, it's kind of like what you were saying. It's like how much gnarlier do movies need to get to give you that fix when like all media is kind of building on top of the last media? It's like when that. I'm reminded of that movie 2012. Did you ever see that?
Yeah. In the cinema, no less. I think.
Yeah, me too. Or The Knowing. I definitely saw The Knowing in theaters, which was weird.
Oh, I watched that as well.
That movie rocks.
Yeah, that's
Nicolas Cage.
The
spoiler alert for the ending of that movie. Who cares?
But I don't remember.
The ending of that movie.
There's something
about a stone, but the ending of that movie is literally the world blows up. It's just like okay.
And it's just 2012 of John Cusack.
Yeah, it does. Okay. Yeah. And LA,
I
LA gets
don't know
destroyed.
whether this is it a thing that happens that exists already in analysis, but I sort of feel that we've, not you and I, but other people and I have sort of banded around the sort of like relationship between John Cusack and Nicolas Cage as being like John Cusack being the good Nicolas Cage kind of thing. There is a movie that they're both in together. I've never watched it.
I have no idea what that would be. Must love dogs. No, I have no idea.
Sorry.
But it's interesting because, like, right when we talk about movies like 2012 where the whole world gets destroyed and the knowing where everything blows up and it's all just like the biggest CGI and stuff, it's like you really get what he's saying about like all of these things, you know, this doesn't have much to do with fantastic or art or anymore.
But that's not similar or equivalent to what we were describing about some sci-fi films where they're just like the future is bleak.
Exactly.
It's just this sort of like apocalyptic end.
It's a spectacle
almost. Like, it's just like it's a spectacular end to your. What it's funny, isn't it, that we would go to watch movies where like it's just the end of the world. It's just the kind
end,
of thing.
But just dope. Like, honestly, and that's the thing. It's like that's okay. Two problems I kind of have with this style of like academia is like, one, how do you quantify that? You know, how do you quantify this idea of like, wow, all movies now are doing this thing? And it's like, oh, are they? It's like, yes, they are. It's like, okay, I can't argue with you on that because it's like...
This is one of those sort of speculative things. We just like, I'll put out the assertion. And...
but it's like at the same time, it's like all that cultural theory and all that is really important. But it's like, you can kind of bend everything to your will. You can kind of bend what data sets there are to your will to kind of make any point you want. Having said that, I do agree, though.
Yeah, I kind of know what he's aiming at.
Exactly. Yeah.
I don't know whether this is meant to be a... there has been some kind of progression in culture and a progression in what it means to be a human existing in the world.
Sure.
Is this sort of a chronological transition that's happening? Like, fantasy used to be a sort of like outlandish supplement to a sort of banal existence, and now we've transitioned to the point where fantasy is this banal supplement to a really sort of like horrific existence in some respects. Like, I
mean, I think it's kind of easy with that argument to be...
I don't know how you... What actual real-world progression do you map that onto, kind of thing? I mean, I suppose you can, right? Like, you could map it onto the disintegration of the post-war consensus and now a sort of like neoliberal world that we now exist in. Or you could map it onto just quite how... There has been this increasingly pervasive development of... I mean, I suppose what Adorno and Horkheimer would call the culture industry kind of thing. The culture industry has increased its grip on us, on our minds. Sort of PR and advertising have taken over the world to some extent. And now we've gotten to the point where social media and its connection to like online advertising has become so sort of pervasive and so sort of like intrusive.
Yeah.
I don't know how that correlates to what I was trying to say, but hopefully there's some meaning.
I mean, we're just spitballing this episode. We're just going
pretty much like the essay, isn't it?
yeah, exactly. So then he goes on to say, I'm going to read another quote. He says, fantasy artworks of all kinds have become depleted of cultural substance because fantasy matters too much. There, you make a wish because that's the name of the essay. Fantasy has too much potential to subvert and explore the differential of freedom. And I'm going to keep going, but this is, I think, the main issue that I have with this piece. It must be subdued, controlled, channeled, and sublimated so that it cannot serve to negate the spectacles that blind us to social forces that determine our lives. The culture industry realizes the potential of the fantastic by commodifying it. Fantastic elements are produced and reproduced to become important ingredients in the constitution of constant spectacles that impede cognition of the operative principles of the socio-economic systems in which we live. Delusion has become the goal of fantasy, not illumination. Fantasy has become so common that it has now become banal. And okay, so I agree with him. I agree with what he's saying, but I think, and it wasn't, like, I didn't really understand why I was disagreeing with him until you said that about kind of like his language in this piece. Because I think, and I don't necessarily... I'd like to give him credit that this isn't what he's implying, but it's almost like he's implying that the culture industry stuff is all intentional and that there's like somebody at the top like pulling the levers to like commodify fantasy and like make it like this and make it like that. Because it's like when he says it must be subdued, controlled, channeled, and sublimated so that it cannot serve to negate the spectacles that blind us. He's basically saying that like if fantasy did exist in what he kind of considers its true form, which is like showing us different ways that we can do things, which isn't necessarily just utopian, right? It can be a bunch of different things, but it's like he's, like I said, he's kind of almost implying that it's intentionally done, whereas I think this is probably what he's saying, but I don't think it's very clear. I feel like it's a lot more just kind of like a fait accompli. It's like, if you have this society in which we all have to accept these social relations, then you can't really have popular fantasy that negates that, right? It's just because that's just the way it works. Because if we did, it would just scramble everybody's brains too much. Or maybe the things that become popular are the things that delude us. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, you might even say that, like, it's beyond the capabilities of the culture, the people who produce culture, to give us something which is antithetical to the structures which support their existence, kind of thing.
Yeah.
Like, not even why would they, but are they even remotely motivated to? Or
it's not necessarily that they're just like crushing these ideas of fantasy, right? Which I almost feel like that's kind of what's being implied because of the language of this piece.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I'm not sure. He's clearly making the suggestion that human beings have some sort of capacity to fantasize, and by virtue of that fact, to generate liberatory, utopian, potentially revolutionary new ideas, kind of thing.
Yeah.
But also, like, fantasy is structuring of our engagement with the world, and the culture industry has discovered this fact about human beings and then has sought to exploit it in some way to sort of like, it does sort of smacks of
I know there's a word for it.
Sorry.
There's a word for it, but I haven't been able to think of it too. This like intentional thinking of like it's all on purpose. I don't know. I can't think of it.
Yeah.
I don't know. Anyway, not to interrupt.
But I mean, it's interesting. Although I don't want to put too much like almost conspiratorial quality into it, kind of thing.
Maybe that's the word. Yeah, conspiratorial.
But I mean, like, societies. It makes sense that the ruling class, the ruling structure, the ruling ideas of a society would be perpetuated in all areas of its output, kind of thing. I don't know. What's that Marx quote about the ideas of the ruling class become the the ruling ideas of society?
Yeah. All about ideology and whatnot. It's tricky, isn't it? Because the latter half of this piece is primarily concerned with examples to prove his points, right? And he gives the points where he talks about some examples of media that show things as they are, which is in kind of like an intentionally negative light, as kind of satire, as almost being like not very helpful, right? He brings up the Simpsons, South Park, and Family Guy. So he says, in these certain animated television series, Simpsons, South Park, Family Guy, the dysfunctional families and communities are exaggerated depictions of the changing relations in American society that indicate how bedeviled we are by our contradictions. Irreverent, ironic, and irrelevant critiques of American quotidian life are created through the behavior of characters who represent family and community gone amok. Whereas many writers and artists have employed the fantastics to suggest alternatives to decadence, that is, societies in decline, there's clearly a strong dystopian tendency in popular culture for young people suggesting that social conflicts and injustice may never be resolved, and that the outcome of the struggles may be neo-fascist societies as projected in Brave New World in 1984. That kind of goes back to what we were saying at the beginning, right? It's like, where do you find a place for like dystopian stuff, and how could that help, right? I've always found shows like The Simpsons and South Park, that is done by Family Guy, but specifically like The Simpsons as being really helpful in a critique of American life. I think precisely because it is accessible to everybody, right? And that it is anti-authoritarian, but it's also very much like everybody likes The Simpsons, you know what I mean? Kind of like no matter who you are. And so like the lives and the societies that it's critiquing, I think are very much like I don't know, I think it's very worthwhile. I think it's very not necessarily just being like, well, there's no other way, right? I think potentially in doing that, it does open up possibilities, right? Like, I don't know, what do you think?
Is that his interpretation? What I thought he was saying was that by sort of like poking fun and putting a sort of like humorous spin on these things, it was sort of making normal these
Sure.
dysfunctions kind of thing. Like it was saying these societal dysfunctions, the breakdown of family, the breakdown of community to some extent. I don't know.
Yeah. The family unit. We got to have our family values.
I mean, I'm more interested in community than I'm in
Yeah,
family. So,
sure, yeah.
I mean, The Simpsons has been going on in the same vein for 30 or 40 years kind of thing. It does project sameness and sort of a degree of consistency onto what we experience as changing, as a sort of changing world kind of thing.
I think
I mean, maybe there's a possibility for all media, right, to sort of like function as a familiar touchstone in a changing world kind of thing. Which might come back to that sort of incredible credibility of the real kind of thing. Like,
Yeah.
Or is that the phrase? I don't know.
Yeah. Good job.
Something to that effect. Where, like, yeah, we need these sort of, like, familiar touchstones that don't ever really change kind of thing.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, I think that his critique, if that is what it is, we get to have him in the room to talk about this, but I think if that is what his critique is, it's like a generation of TV too late. Because I think that, like, that might have been true for All in the Family. I don't know what British shows that would have been true for. But, like, I think that Simpsons did something slightly different.
Mocks a type of television program from a generation beforehand kind of thing.
Exactly. And so, I mean, South Park did it, I think, maybe like a slight, like, half generation or something a little bit later.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Like, it was kind of mocking and satirizing something different than The Simpsons was. Although at the same time, like, kind of still that same kind of, like, typical American, you know, family unit kind of thing. Yeah. I do kind of think that The Simpsons was a little bit more like, it isn't showing you fat Homer, lazy Homer, who doesn't know how to vote and doesn't, like, do any of these things and is just kind of a schmuck who drinks beer, to be like, you should be okay with that. You know what I mean? And that's okay if that's who you want to become. It's like the heroes of that show, when there are heroes, are Homer when he does something brave and courageous or for his family, or just like, it's always Lisa, right?
Sure, yeah, it's funny, isn't it? I mean, it's by virtue of the type of, the sort of syndicated nature of the show, and I mean, Star Trek falls into this trap quite a lot, where it's like, but The Simpsons are an interesting example of it. Like, there is a normal way of functioning, but the episodes are all about characters stepping outside of their normal way of functioning.
Yeah.
But only for that 20-minute
exactly
segment, and then you're back to the next episode where everybody. When in some respects it's interesting, right? It presents a blank canvas with which to do things with every week, kind of thing. So perhaps it's not entirely sort of like unvaluable.
Yeah, exactly. I do wonder too, like what utopian, because I think to say utopian kind of conjures up this idea of like Thomas More, right? And like the very explicit, like I was saying, like Le Guin style things. But like, I think that it can, and again, Zipes says this and I agree with him, but like it can be done in a lot more like subtle ways.
Sure.
Right?
I mean, he's drawing his definition of utopia from Bloch, right?
Yeah.
And Bloch's definition is not utopia as a worked out system. It's more like a sort of like fleeting element or fleeting nature of a small element of something you might interact with briefly, kind of thing.
Yeah. He says, exactly. Bloch says, this is kind of Zipes discussing Bloch. He says, utopia cannot be defined, but is constituted by fantastic elements in life and in art that embody the daydreams of a better life, that is, a different life. A better life can only distinguish itself from what it negates in its differential freedom that is provided by the fantastic. So it's kind of like, what do you like? The fantastic and utopia can just be in your daydreams and can just be imagined, right? So to kind of talk about that a little bit more, I've always kind of thought that there's like an interesting distinction to be made in utopia, in that it can be fairly subjective, but at the same time points towards a lot of similar things from people on two opposite ends of the spectrum. So like an example I've used before is Le Guin and Tolkien, right? Le Guin is like this very progressive, like anarchist, right? She was writing at a time when there weren't a lot of women writing in sci-fi. She was very successful. A lot of her stories kind of break the typical molds of fantasy and science fiction. And then Tolkien is like this, he's like a middle-class Tory, right? He's like someone who went and fought for his country and came back to enjoy all the finer things in life. And why would I ever go to another country? I have everything I need right here, right? And it's funny because, like, obviously in Tolkien you have stuff like all the characters are like white men, basically, right? And there's a lot of like kind of hearkening back to this idealized vision of feudal England, right? But at the same time, he's kind of like, his critiques of society that are in his books, like the Lord of the Rings trilogy or The Hobbit, or even just the Silmarillion, are like fairly progressive, right? Like he believes in community. He believes the only way things ever happen is through like solidarity being shown, and the characters in all of those books who try and act alone are like bad things 100% of the time happen to him. To try and act alone. The only people doing that are like Sauron, Morgoth, like all of these bad people, right? And it's interesting because like those same tropes show up in Le Guin's work. And so it's like, to the extent that both of these authors are like utopian thinkers, they're complete opposite ends of the spectrum, basically, right? Like I think that like Le Guin probably had a lot of respect for Tolkien as a writer, but maybe not as like a, like very progressive guy. yeah, exactly. But I think it's interesting that they critique modern societies, and again, they're writing in like relatively modern or similar times. They're critiquing the same elements of society, and that's kind of like the utopian element of both of their works. So it's funny when you look at like stuff now and see what they're critiquing. It's like they're critiquing the same things. They're critiquing all of this like atomization that happens under capitalism, alienation. That's why like with Tolkien, it kind of comes back to like ideas of like community, but also like family. So that's where he goes with his critiques, but they're all like the same things. And so it's like, I don't know, it's interesting to try and compare critiques like that to modern things, like more modern things, like let's say Star Trek, where it's like, where, I suppose it depends on which one you're talking about, but like where do the utopian elements kind of come from in those shows? You know what I mean? Like, what do you think in terms of like science fiction? Obviously, because that's different. It's not hearkening back to like a previous age where you can point to see like, here are all of the things we're missing from then. Wish we still had those things. That would be great. When people weren't as atomized. As opposed, like, what's the difference looking forward in science fiction? And you know what I mean? Like, what are those elements in Star Trek to you? I guess is like a way of phrasing that, or like science fiction in general. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I don't know.
Dan, the sci-fi guy.
I'm supposed to step in as a sci-fi person. There's a section of this. I don't know whether this is where I want to go straight away.
Yeah, go there.
There's a section of this where he's really talking about fandoms.
Yeah.
And there was a little while yesterday when I was trying to think about fandoms and things which I've engaged with. Now, he suggests, jumping around a little bit, we've touched on it a little bit, but he suggests that the virtue of good fantasy writing is that it leaves enough play of elements for the reader to sort of do something with them, sort of like create of their own kind of thing, which doesn't necessarily happen a huge amount in fandoms. Although he talks about what's evident in fandoms is the real desire that people have to engage with a world, and not have it be defined purely by the media that is presented as being part of that, as it being a depiction of that world kind of thing, but to almost live in kind of thing. I was thinking yesterday about the fantasy and the sci-fi worlds in which I have lived, or in, for want of a better phrase, at some point in my life as a sort of like child and teenager kind of thing. Which worlds did I inhabit, and which ones did I kind of just receive as a product kind of thing. And I think Star Trek's probably one more in the kind of just receiving passively. Now, it had a tremendous amount of influence on my life, and there are elements of it, or sort of notions presented, which were really meaningful. But I think the worlds that I really lived in were, to some extent, I was thinking yesterday about Warhammer 40,000.
Sure. Not a place you'd want to live.
Yeah. Not utopian, and I don't even think utopian in the way that this essay is really depicting. But by virtue of the type of media it is, it really does intentionally leave the world open. And maybe it was just because it was all engrossing in a period of my life, right, where I inhabited Games Workshop literally, and or resided in Games Workshop literally, and inhabited the world figuratively kind of thing. But I suppose it's akin to sort of childish play in general. Like children, I don't know. I mean, and I think that perhaps that activity of creative play extended into my teenage years. I don't know when it's supposed to, but I guess ideally it never dies off, but I feel like in my own experience it has sort of died away in a way. But that was a world which I sort of felt like I inhabited more so than others. And it's interesting, right, because it's a really brutally horrible, like cartoonishly terrible world.
Intentionally so,
yeah. But it's very premises. It's premised on a notion of not only is it there to supplement a game, and a game which you interact with in quite a creative way.
Sure.
In multiple ways, right? You create your own narratives for your activity. You also like create physical objects, supposing that you're also engaged in playing the game, kind of thing. But also, it's sort of like founding principles are like rule of cool kind of thing.
Yeah.
Like, whatever you think is allowed to be the case, kind of thing. And it's just a whole series of sort of like adult men over several decades just trying to outdo each other with the most ludicrous notion possible, kind of thing. That's not necessarily liberatory, but I think as a type of like creative endeavor, it's one which is like sprawling and open, and
yeah. Well, I think
I was trying to compare it to other fandoms, right? Like, how is it that people? Because there are certain ones which are really dictated how you're allowed to engage with the thing. I was trying to think about something like Harry Potter,
sure,
and how people associate with the world of Harry Potter. And I'm sure there are people who associate with it in a sort of creative and open way. But it just, from the outside, it seems like it sets very definite premises for what words mean, what sort of notions mean. It's all about sort of like, I mean, this is the case with, I mean, any sort of fandom or any sort of like a attachment to a particular type of narrative creates a type of person who is very kind of like liturgical, is that the right word, or very sort of clinical in their sort of like, they're very kind of like, they just want to argue the point about precise meanings kind of thing.
Lord of the Rings people don't do that.
Well, I have no doubt. Yeah.
What was that just saying about Sauron being an elf?
Yeah.
Fucking idiot.
I don't know where this is going really. Well, but like there certainly is something about the way Harry Potter and what it means is sort of dictated, or what it means to enjoy Marvel is kind of dictated by Marvel, the sort of the corporation kind of thing.
Yeah.
In a way which sort of like, I don't know.
Yeah.
Do you think there is meaning and value in a certain type of attachment to a sort of piece of media? Or, I mean, I'd be totally willing to concede. I mean, it's certainly actually the case that maybe any of those attachments to media were coping strategies, kind of thing. Like,
sure.
Most teenage attachments to sort of fixations on a thing are coping strategies with this sort of shock of adolescent development, I suppose.
Yeah. Well, that's kind of what he's saying on a kind of like micro level, right? Because he's saying that same thing, but about all of society. Mm-hmm. And so let me just kind of like bring up the difference that I think is between like spectacle and like
fantasy.
And and I suppose fantasy. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, it is kind of like spectacle is like something that potentially we actually want to interact more with, because it is a lot more visceral, like, but what if you were a big dude shooting a gun? You know what I mean? Like, what if you were on a big planet and you were a space marine?
Now we're going to get quite Freudian in our interpretation of fantasy.
I mean, a dude with a tiny gun. It doesn't have to be a big gun. I don't need a big gun. But it's
Do you imagine yourself a space marine? Or?
Oh no. If you were a space marine, which legion would you belong to? But I mean, I don't know. And I think that kind of the difference between spectacle and like more utopian fantasy is one that that fits nicely with the points that he's making, right? Because it's like, as the culture industry commodifies media more and more and more and more, and just kind of feeds into our like primal instincts of what we want to see, What we want to see is kind of like not necessarily what's good for us or what we want to see. You know what I mean? It's not really changing things. It's like kind of feeding into that same thing that we hate. It's like, it's almost like frustration, right? It's like you want to be like, I don't know what kind of nerd would want this, but like a dude riding around Rohan on a horse, right? Like fighting orcs. Because that's kind of like, it's like escapism. Like spectacle, I think, is inherently escapist. Whereas like maybe fantasy, as he means it, is a little bit more like you're doing something about it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Yeah.
Having said that, I think that he does not give enough credence to spectacle because it's awesome, right? I mean, it's just awesome. I mean, I don't think he's giving any credence to it at all because he's basically saying it does not fit this idea of like Adorno, Bloch, Horkheimer's view of art needs to be utopian. I remember I used to be really into ceramics, and I took a course a while ago, and I made this kind of like sculpture of like this kind of like demon head. And then I made like this series of things with like kind of like kooky horns and like, and it was just fun. Like I was just having fun. I was just going with whatever.
I'm nodding approvingly.
Yeah, keep your psychoanalysis out of this. But I remember my teacher like looking at it and being like, so why did you make this? And I was like, just because it looks cool. I think it looks really neat.
I was very worried when I started reading this that it was going to be very much like, it's going to feed into a very pretentious way that people talk about their art.
Exactly.
It's fortunate, actually, that he is presenting the fantasy element in the production of art as being something that both parties are responsible for, both the producer and the person that's sort of consuming, for want of a better word. And it really the creative act happens with the recipient of the art, much more so than the person producing, which is nice in that it doesn't lend to this kind of like pretentious way that sort of artists have the potential to talk about their art as being,
which is
having
very
really
like
deep meaning kind of thing.
The Frankfurt School really kind of like is
teetering on the edge
there. Absolutely.
Yeah, that's what I've always got. I haven't really. I'd like to do it more. I'd like to read some Horkheimer and Adorno, and I haven't really engaged with that. But I've always imagined them as being sort of like slightly pompous relics of an age where they're unable to sort of like engage with rock and roll or jazz or whatever.
We'll read some Bloch. We'll get there. But the point that I'm kind of trying to make is that like when I made those sculptures, my teacher was like, I don't get it. Why'd you make this? And he was like really pushing me to be like, well, why did you create this? Why'd you create this? And I was like, it just looks cool. I think it looks cool. It's that dichotomy between like, there's art that is like, wow, it's art in the way the Frankfurt School means it, where it's like, it's really, I'm interacting with it and it's like almost utopian. It's dissatisfied with something and it means something and wow, look at this. Oh my God. But then there's just like art that's like, damn, dude, that looks so cool. And that's kind of the spectacle, right? And it's like kind of trying to balance that. I could be taking this way too far, but when people theorize about what art would be in a fully socialist society, I think that's really interesting because it's like, it could just wind up basically just being spectacle, right?
Right, okay.
Well, wait, what were you going to say?
Everybody just expressing their cool, the desire for the cool.
Exactly. But
and to be honest, like, I really want people to engage with an idea of a sort of liberated future society and be like, yeah, that'd be pretty neat kind of thing. Like, that's cool. I want that. I mean, but it's like that's aesthetic virtue. I want sort of like socialism or what have you to have some kind of aesthetic appeal.
Are you aesthetically virtue signaling?
I don't even know what that would mean.
I don't mean either. I don't know.
I mean, it's dangerous, right? Because it's also the thing which inspires people's fidelity to characters like Elon Musk.
Yes.
Or
interesting.
Or the like kind of thing. Like, he speaks to. I mean, he's spoken to my sense of that's pretty cool kind of thing.
Yeah.
Being someone who was nurtured themselves on sci-fi and
I always kind of thought he was a bit of a tool, but whatever.
I was on the fringes of the cult for a little while.
Sure, yeah, why not? Again, like that's the thing. It's like when we post-war compact, when everything's been ripped apart and there's no community and there's no government where we feel like we're a part of this public sector that brings us to this effing stars. Like, how cool is that when that's gone? It's like, oh, someone's doing it. That's pretty cool. You know, like,
But it does. But it does create this sort of like. It's unfortunate the people that I'd like to associate with, to some extent, the people in the world who are really sort of like fetishized space.
Sure, yeah.
Have ended up sort of like also have now decided that what leads to that being achieved is entrepreneurs and corporations.
Yeah.
You need a great figure to come along and sort of like lead the journey to the. I mean, they'll build the big statue of Elon Musk on Mars. Kind of
Mars is going to suck.
Yeah. It's shit.
It's one of the worst planets.
Venus,
Jesus.
I'd move to Venus.
Oh.
But like Mars sucks.
no way.
Mars sucks. They all suck. It's sad. It's really quite a shame
that they all suck.
But they all suck. Yeah,
they all do kind of suck.
Yeah.
No one's ever been able to...
It's almost as if we're perfectly designed to live on this planet.
Wait a minute. It's almost like we should just be looking after this one.
It's true. It's true.
Then you couldn't buy your
I really don't like that. Like, I there is so much appeal to me in discovery of that sort. Like,
sure,
going to other planets.
absolutely.
Maybe not as people, but as sending probes, sending robots, kind of thing. Like, there is a degree of wonder in it, which maybe it sparks my sort of utopian desire to some extent. Like,
totally, 100%.
But maybe it's just that I fall for this kind of like, I don't know, like, Human beings aren't parasitic, but we do harbour a parasite called capitalism, and if we don't eradicate that first, we're just going to take it everywhere we go.
Damn. What, you mean the libertarian like space utopia on Mars isn't going to be good enough for you? No.
I mean, I do wonder to some extent, like, I have wondered what a Martian political economy would be.
Interested. I mean, I have no idea. Just making potatoes like they did in that Matt Damon movie. Is that Matt Damon?
I like that film.
The Martian?
Yeah.
Yeah. I remember being. I was like,
I find it's very. I mean, that's spectacle for me.
Sure.
It's very kind of like, there are a bunch of movies which I can watch quite easily and watch them multiple times and just absorb it. I don't really do that very much anymore. I tend to watch a movie and then I'm done with it, kind of thing. But I've seen The Martian a fair few times just because it's sort of
interesting,
narrativistically rounded and like,
Have you read the book?
No, I have
the
not.
The book's really cool. I think it's that book where there's one.
It's really terrible.
No, wait, is
really
it that
badly
book?
Written anyway.
I think it's that book where there's one scene where like oh god, this might not be that book, where he comes across a like alien randomly and he's just like, what are you doing here? And the alien's like, what are you doing here?
It seems really unlikely to have happened in the Martian.
It must have been a different book. Oh, it's the Martian Chronicles, I think.
Okay.
Is that a different book? Yeah, no, that's Ray Bradbury, I think. The one I read, I think, might have been looking it up.
Yeah,
don't look like an idiot.
The Martian Chronicles sounds like something that I have come across.
Typing it in.
I don't know. I wish I had the capacity to read science fiction read.
It was Ray Bradbury, Martian Chronicles.
To read fiction in general, because there's lots of great sci-fi that I'd quite like to.
Are you still listening to the Dispossessed audiobook?
No.
Okay. Well. What's the main guy's name? It's a funny name. Shevik.
Yeah.
Shevik. He's pretty cool.
Yeah. It was interesting what you were saying though about Lord of the Rings, because I'd never thought about Lord of the Rings as having utopian elements really, but I'd usually lumped it together in that genre of fantasy, which is very much like, here's a sort of steady state world that never really changes. Much like how people, I don't know.
It was a zero growth economy.
But there's effectively there's lots of things that happen, but there's effectively no sort of history in a sort of developmental way.
Whoa, Dan. Whoa.
Oh, it's not historical in that like events have consequences which cause changes and progressions and like development and maybe I don't know.
Incorrect, but I see what you mean. It is very much about the status quo, though, right? Yeah. And it's harkening back to
I think
this
Star
idea
Wars
of
is very similar in that it's quite ahistorical in that there's these two sort of states, right? There's either various types of republic or various types
Yeah.
of Sith Empire,
Yeah.
and you just alternate between the two.
Yeah.
And it doesn't seem like the technology. I mean, we've learned over the past few weeks that technology can stay very same for long
Sure.
periods of time. Like,
Yeah.
it is possible to have like types of political economy that are very stable. But Star Wars just seems to be reliant on this dichotomy that flips back and forth kind of thing.
Well, let's
There
be
is
honest.
no dialectical progression in Star Wars. It's very much just sort of like
Let's write
a
George Lucas a
dyad
letter.
of like positions. Yeah.
Yeah, well,
don't
I'll
know.
be honest. The rebels can't make a sustainable society. They just can't. It's been proven over and over. And I'm not saying this as any kind of like pro Sith guy, but like, am I?
It's the Pro Sith podcast, everybody.
Pro Sith podcast.
Yeah. I'll tell you what, the one thing that I think perhaps I did one piece of sci-fi which I think I did engage with in a way which was somewhat utopian in the way that he's suggesting was Stargate SG-1.
Never
Did
seen
you
it.
ever watch any Stargate SG-1?
Never watched any,
It's
no.
cool. It's it for me. I think. I mean, it had a lot of appeal to me. But one of its most interesting elements is that. I mean, basically, what has happened in Stargate SG-1 is that the ancient aliens have distributed humans across the galaxy.
Okay.
They were taken as sort of slaves, and then also like as hosts, because sort of parasitic hosts to these sort of like evil aliens kind of thing. And then Earth has subsequently shut itself off from this being a subject planet of a galactic empire, and then our human society is developed
Nice.
as we are up until the 90s when Stargate is set.
Oh wait, and so we didn't know that we were.
We
part
had
of-
no idea. Yeah,
Cool.
yeah. And then you discover this ancient device which creates wormholes between different planets and connects this group of Air Force people
Air Force.
to a galactic network
Cool.
of human groups of human beings who are taken from lots of different human cultures, and then also have been allowed to either develop or not develop in their own kind of way.
Oh, that's cool.
So they don't. There are very few cases where they meet groups of aliens, groups of humans rather, who are more advanced than they are. Quite often they find like people still living in like they still find the sort of the Norse settlement still living in
Gotcha.
as sort of like Nordic people might have done several thousand years ago or what have you, or they find this sort of Egyptians still living as ancient Egyptians kind of thing. But there is one episode in the first series where they meet a group of advanced human beings, and they really desperately want these human beings to share their technology with them, and these human beings have had this experience of sharing technology with another human species, and then that human settlement destroyed itself, so now they have this principle of not sharing their technology, blah, 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 blah.
Yeah.
But the idea that is put forward in that episode is that human beings on Earth suffered this thing called the Dark Ages, and we were sort of set back in our development, whereas it's possible human beings not having suffered
gotcha.
that setback
Yeah.
could have developed much further than we have, kind of thing. Now, from our reading last week, we discovered that we shouldn't look at the development of technology and the development of capitalism as being a simple human process that needed only to have us like be liberated from
The shackles.
the shackles of feudalism, kind of thing.
But
But as a piece of sci-fi narrative, I remember it striking me quite a lot as whatever I'd have been 8 or 9 or something. This notion that like human society can develop in different ways, other things are possible, kind of thing. I don't know. And as a theme in Stargate in general, I thought that what excited me was this possibility that other worlds, other ways of living as human beings were possible, kind of thing.
yeah.
None of them were particularly utopian in their actual character, but what I think what one element that spoke to me quite heavily was this sense of like at least possibility, kind of thing, and that possibility being contingent on sort of like historical development and other events, kind of thing.
Yeah. So was that then like kind of a setting that you would have wanted to have like been in? Like was it like Something like that?
I don't know.
Or was it like...
I mean, like, I probably wanted to be the person exploring the galaxy.
Sure, yeah. Yeah.
So I don't know. Maybe it didn't inspire action in me so much as a sense of possibility.
Yeah.
Which is plausibly positive in and of itself.
Yeah, it is interesting because it's like, as much as I love Lord of the Rings and stuff, and then just like the Legendarium in general, it's like there have been very few times where I've wanted to have been in that world. And it's like Harry Potter, I like loved when I was a kid, obviously, but it was like, that's a world I would like, whenever anyone's like, oh, like if you could live in any like fantastical like realm,
sure,
Jack, would it be like Lord of the Rings? I'm like, no, it would be Harry Potter.
Yeah.
Right.
But what's essential, the essential element of Harry Potter is something which speaks to a lot of like childhood desire, I think, which is like, lift me out of my banal existence and make me special and put me somewhere where I'm privileged and I am seen as so, kind of thing. Which to Zipes, I guess, is like what he's talking about in terms of like spectacle versus fantasy. Yeah, I don't know whether that's spectacle or... I mean, it feels more like spectacle in the sense of like,
just get me out of here.
It helps you cope, kind of thing.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm not actually a human being. Maybe I'm an alien planted on Earth, and at some point the aliens are going to come and take me away to my like.
I thought you were talking about Harry Potter, and I was like, Dan, have you not read the books? I was like, what the hell?
I mean, this is a fantasy more in line, I think, with my kind of like
childish
desire kind of thing.
Yeah, but I mean, again, here's another thing that I think is important when you're doing cultural theory is that like these things are very rarely mutually exclusive. It's like, while Harry Potter can be like seen as spectacle, as a broad put it in this category so we can study it, there are like really utopian themes throughout it, just in the way people treat each other, right?
Sure.
I mean, like, you know, Harry gets adopted basically by this family because they see that like he's an outcast and nobody loves him, so they take him in because it's like, why wouldn't they? You know what I mean? That's not really something you see a lot in like, at least that's not what you're told you should be doing in the modern world, right? You're told, you know, act for yourself, money, get everything. It's you. It's just you, because it kind of is just you. So it's like when you see something like that, it's like, oh, I wish I was a Weasley. Not saying anything, obviously not saying anything about my family. I love you guys very much, but it's like, you know, you can kind of make yourself a surrogate for Harry, or the other way around, because of how atomized you might feel. Having said that, bit of a spectacle, because it's like zap.
Yeah, I mean, this is sort of what I was trying to get at before, whereas like spectacle and fantasy being the liberatory wing and spectacle being the sort of like thing that makes you conform, they're not wildly separated.
Yeah,
they're sort of like streams that run parallel and sort of crisscross kind of thing.
I got a lot of respect for people who study that and try and make the distinction, because I think it's an important distinction to make, but it's like, good luck.
But the question is what is the value? Maybe as an analyst of culture, it's not necessarily necessary.
Well, I think it's not necessarily what's the value, because I think the value is just trying to understand how we see ourselves and what importance we place on what things, and how that manifests itself in our art. But I think what you might be trying to get at is it's kind of like outweighed importance in maybe in academia, which I'm not saying that that's what either of us think, but it's like when you look at how Marxism has survived as a tool for understanding reality, the world we live in. As we talked in our intro episode, you vaguely study it in sociology as just like a step to the next thing. In economics, at least, you know, in the societies that I come from, you never talk about it. It doesn't get brought up really at all. In the political sense, if you are called a Marxist, you call yourself a Marxist, you're never getting elected anywhere. But it's like in cultural theory, it's still kind of accepted. It's still okay to talk about these things in Marxist terms. Not as okay as like it would be in a free and open world, maybe, but like it's more okay to be an Adorno-y, Horkheim-y, blocky guy than it is to be a you know.
Is that just because nobody believes that the people engaged in cultural studies are actually going to change the world in any meaningful way?
Maybe,
or they're
I don't
not going to
know.
make the effort?
I don't know. I think it's more so just that like, maybe it is that, but it's like almost a very chauvinistic kind of thing in universities where it's like, let the English departments do what they're gonna do. Which I think is interesting because it's like,
I mean, in some ways, it's probably a way in which it perhaps solidifies the view that, say, people in politics departments, perhaps, or people in economics departments, like look down on the humanities, but being like, look at them, they still value these kind of figures. Karl Marx, what a nonsense.
I mean, it's also just the importance placed on STEM.
Having
too.
a class analysis.
Exactly.
They're engaged in these kind of like.
Very true. Very, very true.
Woo-woo humanities activities.
Yeah, and it's funny because like Marxism can help a STEM approach so much, but it's like it's just not used.
Yeah.
You know, what are you gonna do for class-based analysis? Get out of here! Laughable. It is laughable.
I'm thinking about Star Trek now.
Yeah. Go off.
I don't know. It's definitely it's definitely the case that Star Trek made me a communist.
Okay.
So it's probably
expand.
Sir, I can explain if you would just give me a moment.
No, you can't. Don't even try.
Captain, perhaps it would be best if we discuss this.
Shut up!
I beg your pardon.
I said shut up. As in close your mouth and stop talking.
Will, I sense how upset you are.
Probably quite a strong statement.
The first socialist ideal that I ever came across was in Next Generation when they go to 10 Forward and Whoopi Goldberg's, it's like people have been frozen or whatever and they come back and they're like, it's that episode where it's like people from our time are there now.
Oh, right, yeah. I mean, this is the classic. I mean, I think of that episode of Star Trek as being the first one I ever saw. Yeah. Whether it's actually the case, I don't really know. But
exactly.
I've since watched it so many times and sort of like seen it again and again and again.
Well, what happens in that episode, for people who are not as familiar, is that I think it's something like people get frozen cryogenically and then we bring them back because in Star Trek times we have that power, and then they are like, whoa, with the Enterprise, we're traveling through stars. And then they go to the bar, which is 10 Forward, and they try and get drinks from Whoopi Goldberg, and they're like, oh, but I don't have any money. And she's like, we don't have money now. And I remember like trying to get my brother to explain that to me. Because they kind of go into it a bit in that episode, right? Where they're like, well, then what would make anyone want to work at like a gas station? And they're like, people work at gas stations because they understand that it benefits society. I don't know if that's what you meant by Star Trek made you a communist.
Yeah, exactly. It's exactly the episode. There are several times that it happens. That's the classic episode. That this is the neutral zone episode. It's the final episode in series 1.
Wow, okay, I didn't know that. Jesus, and we got a nerd, ladies and gentlemen.
And, there is a point in it in which Captain Picard launches into this monologue. One of the characters is one of the 21st century people brought out of cryogenic stasis into the 24th century is sort of a high-flying businessman of some sort or other, and he desperately wants to get hold of his lawyer. He definitely wants to see how his stock portfolio has developed over the past 400 years.
Presumably,
kind of thing. And he thinks by virtue of being a powerful person in the business world, he gives them the right to demand access to the captain of the Enterprise. Obviously, both Captain Picard and the people of the Enterprise in general are sort of like skeptical of his worth in any way or other. But there's a point when he finally gets hold of him, and Captain Picard has to lecture him on like basically the values of the 21st century. The things that he values from the 21st century no longer have any meaning. Like people pursue ends for the sake of their own enrichment rather than like their financial enrichment kind of thing.
That's what all this is about. A lot has changed in the past 300 years. People are no longer obsessed with the accumulation of things. We have eliminated hunger, want, the need for possessions. We've grown out of our infancy.
Yeah, Star Trek's funny though, because specifically Next Generation, I kind of always thought of like, there are those utopian elements to it. Maybe this just shows that I'm a uncultured swine, but it's like it's still pretty militarized and pretty
Yeah. I mean, these are the critiques, right? Like it's like there's a degree of discipline to some extent, and it shows through in some of the more recent incarnations. Actually, you really get the sense in which people are kind of clocking in and clocking out, and there's a portion which is work and there's a portion which is not. In some of the most recent episodes of Discovery, for example, there are sort of like there are scenes in which like there are just these of innocuous background pieces, which is like somebody talking over the ship-wide tannoy kind of thing, like this drill for this thing has been cancelled at this time, and or this group of cadets are report to this place for this thing, kind of thing.
Yeah.
And it has very much more of a kind of like regimented work feel. Whereas with Next Generation, although they clearly like had shift patterns kind of thing, and like I never really got the sense from it that like anybody was remotely frustrated that they had to be somewhere at a given time, alienated in the activity or the work they were being asked to do.
It is very rare.
Obviously, it is like it is a military vessel to some extent, kind of thing, and obviously there's a degree of discipline which probably doesn't correlate with our highest ideals of sort of emancipated society might look like. But then I don't know, who are we telling?
Yeah, it was very rare in Next Generation whenever they're like, Worf to the bridge, that Worf's like, God damn it.
Yeah, that does seem to happen a little bit more often in some of the newer ones. There is a very excellent episode of Next Generation where Mark Twain is brought back.
Oh, that episode. Oh, I don't know how I felt about that episode.
I don't know about the episode in general. There's just a there's an interaction that happens between Mark Twain and Diana Troy in the turbo lift, where in the space of one turbo lift journey she manages to talk him out of the virtues of like smoking and drinking and whatever, and converts him to the high ideals of the Federation.
Classic. What's your favorite episode of Next Generation?
I don't know.
Really?
I don't know.
I figured you would have had a stock response there.
Yeah.
I think mine is the one where they all devolve. You know what I mean? And like, there's like something happens. I forget what it is, whether it's like a virus or like a parasite, where everybody on board devolves into like their earlier evolutionary phases, and Worf is just like this like weird little thing, and Data's the only one. Like, of course, Data has to save the day again. And
Have you been rewatching it?
kind of randomly.
Okay. Yeah. I've been doing a little bit of random watching of Star Trek recently, but it's been Deep Space Nine and not Next Generation.
Yeah, I've never finished Deep Space Nine.
It's been many years. I did engage in a process of systematically watching every episode of Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, Voyager, over the space of several years, kind of thing. But I did watch them all. But this is 8 or 7 or 8 or 9 years ago.
Who's your favorite captain?
I think Picard.
Yeah.
But that's my Star Trek kind of thing.
Yeah. I agree, but I think that the best captain is Sisko.
Yeah. I think the new incarnation of Christopher Pike in the new episodes has real virtue.
Interesting. Virtue. Wow.
In that he's almost inhumanly accommodating to everybody, and just seems to be designed to be a sort of paragon of niceness.
Oh, gotcha.
Kind of thing.
Yeah.
But not in a sort of like excessive way, kind of thing. Like, I don't know. Yeah. He's kind of Kirk without the libido.
Sounds lame. Kirk never. I like how people never say Kirk is their favorite.
I've never really watched the original series of Star Trek. I have watched the movies, but not really the original series.
I'd like to see a utopian analysis. I don't really care about the original series other than like, haha, it's goofy, funny, silly series. But like the movie where they go back to San Francisco.
For the whales. Yeah.
I'd like to see a utopian analysis of that. They're just like, what the hell?
I mean, that has a lot of those elements of like culture shock of these people from the 24th century sent back to the... I mean, there are lots of episodes. There are multiple episodes where that happens. There's an episode where the crew of the Star Trek Voyager end up... in 1997 LA or something. But yeah. And that sort of culture shock is fun on both ways. Like the sort of, particularly when there's an effort, one of the characters thinks of themselves as some kind of cultural anthropologist of the time, and then proceeds to like really totally misunderstand sort of like cultural things.
Who now we're just not talking about Jack Epps at all.
Yeah.
I already know the answer to this. I don't even know what I'm going to ask. I was going to say who would win in some sort of battle. Something from Warhammer, 40K. Okay, the answer is that, or like the Enterprise. It's the thing from 40K. Obviously, just by virtue of its size.
Yeah, just everything because like everything in the Warhammer 40,000 universe is just
big,
apocalyptically large.
Like, as a good way to put it.
Yeah, it's a large thing that purely goes around instigating apocalypses kind of thing.
Exactly. Destroying planets.
Everything is a technology of apocalypse.
Do you ever think they're going to run out of planets? Do you think anyone's ever... Well, I don't know how many planets are in the galaxy, presumably a lot. Yeah. But there are also a lot of stories about them blowing up planets.
Yeah. There's also a lot of stories about them desperately trying to save planets from ridiculous hordes of enemies for no reason at all. But
yeah, I would like to see a crossover would be so dope. Where just like the Enterprise goes accident, like they try to go into warp, like they try to go to like warp speed, but they just go through the webway and they're just like, what?
Yeah.
That would be dope.
Suddenly find themselves in the warp somehow.
Yeah. Did you see what I sent you, by the way?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
so
there's some
cool.
Tyranids in that as well.
Tyranids, yeah.
Some Tyranids briefly and some orcs.
Yes. Yeah, okay. Dan and I are talking about Astartes, which was a project of, I think it started out as one guy doing
might
this.
Still only be one person.
I think he's outsourced some stuff.
He's doing a little bit now.
But I think it is mainly just this one guy who's, if you know anything about Warhammer, you'll know what we're talking about, but if you don't, you won't care, so I don't know why we're bringing this up. But it's this guy who started this really just like unbelievably, and I mean that literally, fantastic CGI series.
It's the only convincing depiction of characters from the Warhammer 40,000 universe,
and it is mind-bogglingly like well made.
Yeah.
It's stunning. It's absolutely the things they're very, very short. The whole thing is only like, I don't know, like 10 minutes, maybe 7 minutes. But he just released a kind of like very short teaser trailer for his next project, and it looks awesome.
If Games Workshop have any sense,
yes,
they'll be contracting him to do something.
At the same time, though, I think his Patreon is like, he doesn't say.
Is it just blown up now?
Yeah, he hasn't said he doesn't have the number of how much money he's making, but it's like a minimum of like $11,000 a month, and a maximum of like maybe $100,000. So it's like I don't think they're going to be doing that.
Building his own studio.
Exactly. Anyway, that's cool.
Yeah, very cool.
Did I have any other notes to talk about?
I mean, I feel like there was lots in that. A lot's in that text, and maybe we've given it short shrift. I don't know.
It is. I will say we're critiquing it because that's kind of like what would be the kind of point if we weren't. I think it's fantastic. I love Jack Zipes. Nice. I think his cultural theory has a lot of relevance. I think he's building upon the Frankfurt School in a really great way. And I think he's doing it. The main reason I like it because he talks about things that I really enjoy. Right. So
he's also a Lord of the Rings nerd.
Yes, exactly. And yeah, so I like it. I really, really like it. I'll read the last paragraph because why not? Just to bring it back.
Yeah.
He says, fantasy matters because it can enable us to resist such criminality, meaning the culture industry. And it can do so with irony, joy, sophistication, seriousness, and cunning. Whether the fantastic works that we realize become works of art will depend obviously on our talent, but also on our refusal to become complicit in the criminal operations of the culture industry. Hell yeah, baby. Right on. Preach it.
Endorsed.
Yeah. Games Workshop so dope, dude.
Cool. We also endorse cool.
We endorse cool. Yeah.
Anything cool.
We endorse cool. Yeah. If it's not cool and it is spectacle, we'll be like, oh, spectacle. Oh my God. That's so beneath us. But if it's cool, hell yeah.
Yeah, it's so dope.
I don't know. Anything else? I think it's we've been a good episode. We've gone a little bit longer than we usually do, but why not?
Gone long.
Yeah.
We've gone long.
We've gone long.
Congratulations on making it to what I think is about to the end.
Yeah, congratulations. We can see the analytics, by the way. It doesn't give us names, but if it's like nobody listened to the end and everyone's like, oh my God, I loved what you did with like the whole thing, the ending.
Can you see? I have no access to this stuff. I have no access to this.
Yeah, it's not really worth looking at because you'll be like, oh, how many people have listened to us on Google Podcasts? Once, and you listened to half of it. So
at least he didn't just start and then stop.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Maybe he had something to do.
It's true. Yeah.
Maybe they had something to do.
Yeah. Cool. Well, that was Why Fantasy Matters Too Much by Jack Zipes. I think we'll probably be back to the grind pretty soon with something a little bit more kind of meaty. Yeah, but it's fun to talk about things like this.
It's been fun.
It's been a blast. Cultural theory, baby. We're doing it.
We're going to do more, I think. And I think it does weave in with the other topics we've been talking about, right?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, I'd be interested to kind of go a little bit more into some kind of like psychoanalysis stuff, which is 155% your ballpark and not mine. But I think that's kind of why I'd be interested in it. And I think because it could potentially share with some things with us.
Yeah, it's difficult because a lot of my engagement with psychoanalysis, particularly on an academic level, has been to kind of argue against ideas such as this kind of thing. Like, I once wrote a dissertation mostly using a very structuralist reading of Lacan to argue against human creativity, and rather to argue that we're sort of like quite structured by the sort of narratives that we've developed from we've absorbed from the world, kind of thing.
Are you a post-structuralist now?
I don't know. I'm not even sure whether I know what post-structuralism means.
Oh, geez. Rosa spent the whole morning today trying to explain to me what the semiotic was.
Okay, because there is one use of the word
exactly.
semiotic in this.
Well, that was the thing. I asked her. I was like,
why? Because this seems like a really important sentence,
exactly.
and I don't know what this word means.
Well, that was classic, because I was like, oh, what does semiotic mean? And she spends so long trying to explain it to me and doing a fantastic job. And then she goes, well, read me the sentence, right? And I go, I read it to her, and she goes, oh, well, that's semiotics. That's something completely different. And I was like, no. Oh, boy. I'm an idiot. But you're listening to the podcast, so what are you going to do? All right. Let's wrap it up.
We never claim to be a smart person podcasting.
Exactly. Never claim to be that. Yeah, that's it. This has been Auxiliary Statements.
I hope you endorse our cultural tastes. I hope
and if you don't, whatever.
You share our sense of cool.
Yeah.
Oh, no.
That's good.
Tell us what's cool.
Tell us what's cool.
Get in contact.
Get in contact. Give us a call. Dan's phone number is. All right, this has been Auxiliary Statements. I'm Jack.
I'm Dan. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. And we'll see you next time, right?
Bye-bye.
The music you heard this episode was Music to Kill Bad People To by King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard. If you like this song, you can check it out and much, much more on their Bandcamp at kinggizzard.bandcamp.com. Be sure and follow us up on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. And if you like what you heard, be sure and tune in next week for some more commie discussion. Till next time.